All right, welcome to the latest episode of Enterprising Minds. We have a good episode for you today, mostly because I know that we will be able to go on and on and on about this topic. So we're going to talk about audience targeting. Sort of first off, defining an audience and how do you get those insights these days, and then also targeting them, actually, like where to do that, how to do that, what considerations to factor into your thinking. So the genesis of this question came because I've been talking to a number of colleagues and marketing friends recently, and we've been thinking about how much things have stayed the same as they've changed drastically, right? Especially with the advent of AI, and everybody's talking about how things are changing, best practices with that. And is Google broken? All those fun questions that get thrown around the internet like confetti. But ultimately, in my mind, it feels like we are largely where we were like 20 years ago, before social came up, before everybody was, tricking the algorithm, or at least attempting to. You have your paid media platforms that you can launch ads on. You have email newsletters where you can sort of own the relationship and own the customer data. Where they've actually, said yes to you and your company and what it is you think and serve and, do all of those things. And then there's good old fashioned PR, which everybody forgot about because it's hard and it takes relationships, and you actually have to define your audience instead of, just uploading similar audience, charts to your ad platform. So Alex, as the resident media guy here, why don't you get us started off with your thoughts? Do you accept the premise? Do you resonate with it? Where are you going?
I think you're right in terms of things haven't changed a lot over time, but I think the avenues and channels change over regularly. Like if we talk about too far back, you're going to hit MySpace, and then it became Facebook, and then Instagram didn't even exist at that time. So it's like some of those names have changed over, but honestly, you're still advertising to these various similar markets.
Right.
The prominence of LinkedIn rising, I think, is always kind of an interesting one, especially in the B2B space. That was always like a super expensive but not great place to throw ads. Even I'd say 2010, maybe even up to like 2015, it was kind of questionable. It was getting better, but like, especially in the US, you were talking like a cost per lead of 30 to 50. You can get it down to like maybe 17 on a good day. Mm-hmm. Twitter would give you always overinflated numbers because they really couldn't understand that it seemed like their monthly active users worth anything. So their numbers that you give you on volumes were a joke. Right. If you're trying to budget off of it, it was like, take that and then maybe drop it by a third or maybe even half. And that's actually what you're going to be able to spend. Like, I don't know. And there's always a tiny market. And of course it's gotten smaller. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of split like that that's happened. I think it depends a lot on the type of industry that you're in. So retail media has picked up like crazy.
Right.
So if you want to advertise on Target.com, Walmart, Amazon, all the rest of those, that's a huge powerhouse that has a massive amount of budget being thrown toward it.
Right.
Not as much if you're in the B2B space. B2C, absolutely. B2B, not really. So I think that targeting and finding your audience is similar to the way it was back then. I don't really think it's changed a whole lot, especially when we get to the idea of like first party versus third party data. Third party was this hope that if you mash all the data together, you'll come up with audiences that may or may not be actually there and may not exist to the size that they think they will be.
Right.
And that's proved out true. Those numbers are sometimes good, sometimes bad, can be typically very overinflated data points though. So I do want to get down to this though, in terms of like from a search standpoint, keyword from a SEO standpoint or paid search standpoint, there is a huge difference between what Google's keyword tool gives you and the actual traffic that you can ever expect to show up on your website. And I think that's one of those early digital marketer kind of mind-breaking thoughts of, you saw 720 monthly volume. Well, first, that's an average bucketed figure. So that's you'll never see 721. You'll never see, 719. You'll always see only 720 because of the way Google buckets things.
Yeah.
So that's not even a true figure to start with, plus seasonality, plus that's the total volume looking, how many people are actually going to click versus how many people are going to convert. Your funnel looks way different once you start actually working those numbers out.
Right. And that's why when I've communicated up the chain and around whatever organization I'm in, I will tell people keyword volume data is a lot like looking at stocks. There's going to be some seasonality to it. There's going to be a lot of noise in it, but what you're looking for are trends.
Yep.
Because especially as, like slower moving, larger companies, if you did keyword research 5 years ago, well, the language has changed quite a bit in 5 years. The way people search has changed. The demographics and the language within those demographics also change, right? Language is a constantly evolving thing. And you see that in the searches, right? So the keyword that would have worked for you a while ago may not be even valid now. Especially when you're talking the consumer things, right? You're going to burn through those a lot faster, but maybe not so much with, the highly regulated ones where you have to say the right thing at the right time all the time. Right.
I think when we get to, there's kind of a distinction between audience sizing and audience targeting.
Right.
And the first one, I think, gets skipped over all the time. And we immediately go to targeting. Because we assume that there's a target for this particular product or service, which is not a safe assumption. And we assume that it's an ever-growing, ever-gigantic, ever-stream of potential customers that we just need to somehow get into our site. And then we can always have more, and there's always more, and there's always more. And I don't think that's true at all, especially when we start looking like, B2B is one of the most stark examples of that, because you have, it's a great invention for a mechanical engineer in this very, very particular industry, and they really, really like that particular kind of item, and they really need it when they first build a factory. It's like, okay, so we have a very particular type of mechanical engineer who happens to be in this very unique situation, which they don't do every single day. In fact, they're going to do it maybe once every how many years? Quite a few years. So that's a really, really small market, actually. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. One of my favorite stories of this is I was once a part of an agency and we were hired to do some SEO work because I swear someone saw it on the cover of Forbes or something, and they wanted SEO. So I started asking them, okay, tell me about your product. It's an industrial product. Okay, very specialized. Okay, that's fine. Let's work through some of the details. I don't really understand it. Like let's teach me so I understand what kind of keyword research I should do.
Right.
And I got down to it. I was like, okay, so potential customers, country targeting, translations. Let's get down to it. What we're looking at. Well, there's 6. It was like 6 what? 6 potential companies who would ever buy our product. It's like, what? You want to rank number 1 for something? No, just call them. Show up. I don't even care who you're going to grab lunch or dinner with. Just take them out to eat. Figure out your product either has something wrong with it or they want it. And you start the relationship from there from a very sales standpoint, because you don't have the volume that takes search. And that's that audience sizing total miss. I mean, that's a very stark example of it, but
It's true though. I've had those conversations with product marketers a lot actually, where I say, okay, what do you want to try to do? And they're like, well, we want to do search. I'm like, why? Tell me, tell me about your.
Yeah. Why?
Yeah. Tell me about what it is you're doing. What's the market? I'm not familiar with it, to the level you are. So,
Right.
and then they'll start talking. It's like, okay, you want key account marketing.
Right.
You don't want search.
Right.
Like, but if you decide to do this, here's how you would, change your expectations. The types of content you create is completely different. It's not the mass communications, typical blog style content. It would be, to your point, tailored to the specific companies or use cases that you would actually want to do. So, case studies immediately come to mind. And you should do that. You should do that because that's going to be, a better bang for your buck. And it's these other things too of the knowing certain things, like in the US, people live within 50 miles of their employer typically. Okay, that allows us to do some very basic geofencing. Like if we're going to promote our ads on LinkedIn or Google ads or YouTube or whatever, like, great, let's target these people within a 50-mile radius of this headquarters or this particular event that's going on. That's an industry event. Unless it's in Las Vegas, then forget it. Because everybody's flying in.
Trade show capital of the world, I swear.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you could think of it like I was thinking about it almost like an email campaign, because you build out different campaigns for different purposes, but your day one email looks a lot different than your week 17 email. Right. So, and if you think of that same kind of flow and think of all the different marketing tactics as just a part of that same flow, you're probably a lot better off than narrowing in on a particular tactic like search and saying, let's start there. Right. Because its very beginning is who we are. It's the awareness campaign, the let's introduce ourselves sort of thing.
Right.
And maybe that tactic to introduce yourself is paid search. Maybe it's SEO. Maybe it's a PR campaign. Maybe it's a billboard in a particular metro area that is the one you're trying to hit. I mean, something like that. And then you don't have those expectations that you're going to get lead gen out of a billboard. You have expectations that people will know your name. And that suddenly changes like that whole shift. And all the way down, it's like, okay, well, week 17 should be a salesperson calling them. And we don't expect a billboard to do that job at that point.
You know what I found interesting? Last summer, I was in San Francisco, and it happened to be when one of the Google events was going on. And I'm stuck in traffic getting,
so you're in San Francisco.
Yeah, exactly. And I was fascinated by all the billboards that are around because, they were all analog.
Wow.
Which, Silicon Valley, you expect everything to be digital or like holographic or whatever else, right?
Especially with the volumes.
Yeah, exactly. But as I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, okay, how many of these are vanity plays, for all of the little guys that just got the venture funding. But then the other part of it too is if you are constantly stuck in this traffic and you are targeting people in the tech industry,
sure,
this could be a really smart play because you might actually get more exposure on that billboard than you would a typical billboard because, the traffic is so slow for so often. That might actually be one of the smarter plays instead of trying to compete on the digital spots that are more easily ignored.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a good point about that because that's like the better level of targeting piece. We can kind of switch over to that conversation too about there's something you mentioned ahead of the podcast was thinking about the different economies and where, if we're going to focus on particular economies and metro areas as well, and we instead forget countries or regions for a moment and just think about metro areas. I don't know if you want to share the stat, but if you're looking at the top 15 economies of the world, some metro areas actually kind of pop in there.
Yeah. So the story behind that, for the listener.
Yeah.
I was in a discussion around targeting, and they wanted the high up wanted a strategy for the top tier countries that, a global organization would want to go for. And my comment back was, okay, so you want to do like G28? And he said, no, give me something for the top 15. So being the smart ass that I am, I said, what do you want to do about California and Texas? And, it was a joke, but at the same time, it's a valid question, because if you look at the top economies in the world as of May 10th, 2024, California and Texas are, numbers 11 and 15. So if you actually think about the cultures between California and Texas, even on like a very surface stereotypic level, you probably should handle them as separate entities, separate countries, because the cultures are very different, and the messages that will resonate will most likely be very different. Again, depending on the industry and whatever else. So, yeah, I mean, that definitely comes into play, especially with the global piece of, what do I know? What do I need somebody local to tell me about? We've, you and I have joked about how trying to market in Europe is a lot like picking your favorite state in the US. Once you get out of the idea that, okay, a country is a large, group of people, well, not necessarily. The United States is third most populous country in the world. Something like that. Can you fact check me in real time?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, do you have a separate Georgia strategy to Tennessee? Probably not. Unless you're doing something with like college football, then yes.
Number 3, you're right. China, India, US, Indonesia.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, and one of the things that I've been playing around with that influences this discussion ultimately too was the three of us, I think I can speak for the three of us, are fans of Rand Fishkin and what he's done with Moz and what he generally talks about online. And I was using his SparkToro audience tool when it first came out, and I thought it was great, but it was very limited to just Twitter data. And then Elon bought it, and they had a oh crap moment where the APIs were being shut off, and now all of a sudden your tool is kind of useless because you don't have the right data there. And what they've done with the second version of SparkToro is really interesting to me in terms of finding your types of audiences. And I'll just say from the get-go, we have no affiliation with them other than just putzing around with the tool. But they're bringing in Reddit data and LinkedIn data and clickstream data and keyword data, so you can actually parse out people who have these words in their bios, or people who visit these types of sites fall into what categories, what are the other sites that they hang out in, right? And like all of these types of things, for my communications background, really comes into developing the content, developing the targeting, developing the word choice even for how I'm going to, target these people. Because to your point, if you're going to target on Facebook, you might have something like, recent moms or something like that. I mean, you used to be able to do this. I don't know if you can anymore with all the privacy stuff, but for the most part. But then even within that, there's a subset of recent moms with what particular issue, with what particular problem, with what particular need, right?
Sure.
So yeah, that's what got me thinking.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed the tool in terms of also trying to help develop. You mentioned about like kind of tone and word choice too, like getting to that point of persona-based targeting. I think can be a tripping point for a lot of organizations because they get too far into it and they start to really believe that these are the only personas that we are going after, and they're believing all the specifics, which you kind of just throw in for fun to kind of build up the character.
Right.
But tools like that do help in terms of, okay, what kind of sites are we looking at? They're going to, you mentioned Simon Sinek, TED. I mean, like TED Talks, like, okay, we're kind of looking at a tier here that's probably fairly well educated, or it's an individual who is interested in learning a lot. We can maybe make two assumptions on that one. So we probably want to target them a little bit differently than other groups. And if we're doing more of a sports related product, we want to make sure that we're basically bringing in terminology that makes sense and will resonate for that audience. But I'm not too sure about sports analogies in that first audience. Like, you might have some play over that. And I don't want to bring in too many, generalizations and assumptions into it. But the more data you can get around your audience to try to get a better feel for them, I think is useful, especially when you're writing that copy and trying to really kind of emotionally connect with someone.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing too, right? I mean, with good copywriting or good marketing, you have your set of assumptions, and then you write your ad copy and your social posts and your everything else targeting that assumption. And then you write the second batch.
Right.
That is your test batch to see if, the weird, wacky ideas actually work, or maybe they're not interested in X, Y, Z. So how does that change the copy? It's not just, I feel like there's such a checkbox attitude recently, like post-pandemic. I think everybody's so fried that it's just get it done, that we've forgotten the good marketing. We had a really good conversation in the Age of Average show. If everybody hasn't listened to that one, that's probably one I'm the most proud of. So I'll put a link in the show notes for that one. But yeah, just taking the time and thinking and doing the personas, or even like developing the persona is a problem enough, right? Because you hear the feedback from sales going, well, it's, I only talk to these people within these organizations. Okay, great. But as you know, job titles are just as made up as anything else. So
and their decision maker might be someone entirely different than what you're thinking of too. Might be a person who's the end user of your product, but it doesn't mean that's the person who's actually going to be deciding, finding it, purchasing it. Those are probably very different job titles actually from the one who's using it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and in certain industries, you end up finding the decision maker is out in the field, out of the office, and the purchaser is the secretary in the office taking the phone call to say, I need X number of these things delivered to this site.
Right. And if you want to compete on price, who do you need to talk to?
Right.
Second one.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the needs thing is interesting. There's been a number of studies, especially in the B2B world, about how the increase in number of decision makers has grown basically every single year. I think we're up to like 14, 15 for large B2B purchase decisions. It's crazy. I mean, you have to have your sustainability stamp, but the end user doesn't actually care about that, but some do. So that's a part of their purchase process. So therefore that information has to be present somewhere on your website, easily available. to that particular audience so they can quickly find that, and you can stay in the running during this decision-making process because you're really going through decision-making, round after round that your service or product is being brought into. Just like you decide on other people's products, you got to think that your product isn't just this instantaneous decision on a website. There's a whole process to it, especially these really large-scale purchases.
Right.
And having all those elements and really understanding your audience and really knowing your audience, I think that you do get down to it. I think you're right, Dave, that post-pandemic, it seems that we're so focused on quick decisions and like email turnaround than really good, smart decisions. It might take some time, it might take some conversations, and it might take a random mix of maybe different types of facilitation to really kind of get those good ideas out of there. But you have to understand your market before you start targeting your market. And that it's so easy to start up a campaign. I think it's easy to skip that step and say, yeah, we are spending money towards X activity. And the moment it doesn't work, this type of activity doesn't work for us. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. I'm sure you have as well, especially with agency life of, we tried fill in the blank, social, search, SEO, email. In the past, it didn't work for us. Therefore, we're going to just write it off. It's like, did you do it well?
Or you get the flip side of it too of, I don't necessarily believe in this tactic, so I'm going to hire an agency, see what happens. And if it works well, I get to claim credit for hiring this agency. If it doesn't, they're fireable.
Yep.
And you get that political bend too, which, yeah. So many war stories with that one.
That one gets,
cool. So, I mean, in a previous conversation, in a previous episode, you did talk about your figuring out pricing or price targets for your advertising. Do you want to cover that one more time?
You'd have to refresh me a little bit more than that.
So that was, working backward from what is your, is $250 per click?
Oh, sure.
Or the margins on the clicks, right?
Yeah. So there's kind of two pieces there. One is, I'll hit that first because it's very relevant to our conversation. So sizing and appropriate assumption kind of building.
Right.
Big piece about that is let's say we can look at, instead of using direct keywords, we'll talk about the entire topic of a particular product. Right. So everything that's related to it, this versus that, just the product, category by itself, pricing, reviews, add in all these different keywords. You get a bunch of different volumes. You get a pretty significant volume size. That doesn't mean that's your size of your audience, because it could be one person searching 10 times in a row and they'll hit 10 of those different keyword volumes. So kind of keep that in mind. That's not audience sizing. That's just search volume that you might be targeting. Right. And might be targeting because the tools and the seasonality to that you got to kind of take that with a grain of salt. Let's say that's a huge number. I don't know, 10,000 searches a month. Of how many people are actually going to click on you with your paid, versus organic listing, if you're in the top 3 versus the bottom, set of 10, you're going to get a lot more volume if you're in the top 3, right? So let's say you get 30% of the clicks if you're in position number 1. You used to back in the day. It's not so true today, but whatever, 15 to 30%, we'll figure that. So your large figure just suddenly got dropped down to 15% of that figure. That's a pretty small slice. Those landed, your bounce rates, let's say 50%. So now you just lost half of that. So now you're down to a much smaller figure. Those ones, maybe 1 to 3% are actually going to convert after they visited your site. So 1 to 3% of whatever that tiny figure is now your expectation on a monthly basis. So start to do that math with any of your product types or product categories, and you'll realize very quickly that, yes, there may be an audience out there that's large, but how many of them are actually in need of your product and searching in that one particular month is a very different figure. And how many of those will actually end up on your website is also a very different figure, much smaller figure. And how many of those will you actually end up being able to talk to is a tiny fraction of that figure. So keeping that in mind. The second point is talking about valuation. So how do we value one of those clicks so that we can get an ad campaign running? Because we're paying. We're paying for every single click that goes there, and half of them bounce. That's sucks. It's a lot of money that you paid for. Maybe those people are now aware of the site. Maybe you can, claim something off of that, but a lot of them probably landed on the wrong site and clicked back, or they're not interested. And if they're not interested, they're probably not going to remember the name. So let's be honest, not great. So how do we value that click is a key piece of when you start figuring out your budget and your targeting from your advertising standpoint, because now we're putting out bids to get that traffic. How high should we set that bid? Is it worth it? And you hit that number. And I think that's where it gets down to the value game, which I call it a game because all value is a belief that it's worth something. And that's it. Right. It's a belief. So yes, you can figure out customer lifetime value. And if you're in a perfect e-commerce scenario where everything is trackable down to the penny, yes, you can figure out basically a cost per value of a particular visitor, which is still averaged, across the board. There's a lot of different averages that are really playing a part in any of those equations and results. So you kind of have to still take that grain of salt, because still you're going to end up with traffic, still going to bounce, still not going to buy. You just have an average value, assuming those people who haven't bounced or do bounce. So still quasi there. So instead, I like to play this game, which is basically is this. You sit down across from your salesperson, marketer, whoever. You say, if I can get you a whatever it is, webinar viewer. I always love that one because I have no idea what the value of webinar viewer is, and I don't think anyone actually does. Right. If I can get you a webinar viewer on this particular webinar, and I can't claim the value of who this person might be, some 11-year-old who randomly decided to go watch a random webinar. I can't tell you who this person is, but they filled it out. They joined, and I can get that for you for $500. Would you buy that? And they say, that's kind of expensive. I say, okay, fine. $200. Maybe. $150. Yeah, I'd probably do $150. Great. We'll start there. And that's good enough. And they always get nervous at this point because they suddenly feel like they made a big decision, but you have to tell them, no, you didn't. Because what we're going to do is we're just going to target that for like 3 weeks, not even a full month. We're just going to do that for a couple of weeks. And especially if it's a longer campaign, that this works out a lot better. Webinars sometimes are short campaigns, so you got to meet with them earlier than that. And then you sit down and say, okay, you got a bunch of leads. If they're crap, I'm going to assume that you don't want to pay $150 anymore for them. Instead, you'll only pay $75 for them or $50 for them. And that's okay. Now we're going to change our campaign. So now we target a much smaller audience, and we're going to tighten our target and tighten our budgets up and try to become a lot more narrow in our focus. And we'll do that. Or you say, these ones have been great. I'll raise it up. I'd buy anything you can send me for $250. And I say, great. I'll increase my spread and start targeting a lot more different keywords, a lot broader audience. Maybe I'll move up the metro area targeting, whatever it is, kind of targeting them doing. And I'll increase it to basically get more until we find the point where we start seeing the quality drop again. And kind of just keep on meeting, because if you keep those meetings up, you're building trust and relationship, and you're proving that you're working towards their goals, which is getting value for the money. And that's it. That's the belief of value of a visitor.
And it's while you were going through that, I was thinking to myself, as digital marketers, do we suffer from the belief that everything is trackable?
Oh, yeah.
And everything is traceable? Because if you look at trade shows, you spend thousands of dollars per square foot. And that's before you even set up anything.
Yep.
So how much do you if you did a 1-to-1, how much do you have to sell from the trade show to equal out versus your online digital stuff? Can you even track it to that extent? Because how much of the trade show is just getting in front of people, collecting the names to then call the next week? You're gauging interest, and then you have that kind of medium warm lead that you can go chase after, but that's about it.
Yeah. And then you also, this gets skipped over all the time, attribution. Mm-hmm. Attribution, again, is another belief-based system, because a great example of it, Jeff Sauer, he has a lot of analytics information, great guy to follow. He's actually a former manager of mine who kind of went on his own thing and is kind of blown up from it. So he's done really well. He had a great story about attribution. And he said once, so he was in Germany. He had this white wine that was recommended by the bartender, and it was fantastic. And it was from this vineyard that was in, I think, Washington State in the U.S.
Right.
Later, he has some friend who's interested in trying to find a place for a marriage ceremony in Washington State. And this vineyard basically came up as like one of his searches. And there's like, oh, you should check this one out and see if it's good. So Jeff ends up being there also with his, I think then like fiance or then girlfriend. The friend does the wedding. They see some sign that says they got wedding venues as well. They end up talking to the owner of the vineyard who gives them on this personal tour. They really love the story behind it. They really fall in love with all the rest of it, especially the time of year ends up being perfect for the location. So it looks beautiful, this outdoor location.
Right.
To rent the venue is very expensive. I'm going to say, I don't know, $30,000. So some large figure it was really quite a reasonable or quite a large value to put on this thing, right?
Right.
The friend has his wedding. It's great. It goes well. It happens to be good weather that day. Jeff does, I think, his there. Great. Then becomes the question, what sold that venue that day?
Right.
Was it the bartender in Germany, first touch attribution?
Right.
Was it the friend's wedding, last touch attribution? Was it the combination of all these different events and scenarios that somehow basically all created this emotional connection to this various location and ended up being perfect for their particular event and timing and family who happened to be located in the area and friends who happened to be located in the area, and then it made sense instead of flying people in? Like, there are so many aspects to these decisions. So then it gets down to that trade show. Maybe the first touch to that trade show was paid search or SEO or billboard.
Right.
And the last touch was that handshake that was done at that trade show with that business card that said, let's wrap up the deal that we've been talking about. We're going to sign today. And maybe you get a sign on the day of a trade show, which would be amazing. Usually it's leads instead. But then I still am going back to that like email campaign view of every tactic has this value, and you're building up this funnel, you're building up this traffic funnel that basically leads you down to this sale. I can't claim that that trade show was awareness. I can't claim that that trade show was anything on that board, but it was a part of the process. And it did help if the trade show you feel was successful, and again, feel was successful. Maybe you feel that it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, tracking, you can throw a QR code on anything, but good luck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the numbers never match. I don't know. That also seems to be a hidden dirty secret of digital marketing. The numbers never match. How many clicks, how much traffic, how many visits, how many people have JavaScript turned off for privacy blocking, cookie blocking. I mean, all the rest of this stuff, all the way through down to the final sale. The numbers do not match. And to try to think that you can track someone absolutely perfect 100% of the time is a lie. Like,
well, and that's even with the scenario you talked about with the 100,000 search volume and then 30% click-throughs.
Oh, you have no idea.
Yeah, at least a third of the click-throughs that you get will be, tracker blocking. So, 2/3 of whatever it is that you actually got the click for. So, Yeah.
Which gets down to your point at the very beginning of this podcast of, is marketing just like it was 15, 20 years ago before we had all this tracking, supposed data, and all the rest of these things that we're doing. And we just still had trade shows, still had emails, still had all the rest of these things. Has it really changed that much? And quite honestly, at the end of the day for the business, no, it hasn't. Right. We have various tactics that change names, and they have new fancy features and new promises. But really, we're getting down to the day. It's people and people making relationships and making deals. Yep. It doesn't matter if you buy a pair of shoes or, a steak dinner.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right. Well, that's a perfect spot to stop. Hopefully, this was beneficial. I definitely enjoyed the conversation. Let us know
what you've run into recently with targeting.
And if you agree or disagree,
that you like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, give us the feedback, rate, review, subscribe. The reviews really do help us expand the reach and help us understand what it is you like, and where we might improve. So have a great couple of weeks. We will see you in the next episode of Enterprising Minds. Take care and later.
Thanks, all.